Do you guys remember that scene in Fresh Prince of Bel-Air when Will is so excited his dad came back? And he was promised that he'd be able to go on a trip with his dad on his truck route, just to find out day of that his dad bailed before Will ever came downstairs. Why don't they want us? I feel that is the soul's cry of every millennial. Why has every generation old enough to have an opinion hate us? Millennials have been shaped by cycles of neglect. This trauma is displayed in relationships, self-perceptions, and contributions to society. The average millennial's life is punctuated by strong experiences of neglect and abandonment, where shame is the cattle prod surrounding their milestones, and self-deprecation is the only acceptable way to talk about yourself with someone else. Do we command the egg to harden its shell and anticipate being broken? Self-awareness filtered through neglect is only motivated by self-doubt. Millennials are haunted by perfectionism, failure, and the pressure to hustle and grind. Neglect isn't always in the form of active abuse, but it shows itself in passive disregard. The cycle shows itself in how millennials treat themselves and others. Shame is a tool used by people, kids and adults alike, to control others and themselves, whether it makes sense or not, whether there's benefits or not. The way shame has developed as a social tool in the US has gone from outcasting others for not following fads to blackmailing people into suicide. Low self-esteem leads to neglect. This isn't discounting nuance or contextual factors. I would say at the core of those contexts and nuances is low self-esteem. In previous videos, I have brought up the concept of the shame spiral and how it has both positive and negative areas on the scale, but are solely attributed to neglect. So we've established what the cycle of neglect looks like. We can start pointing out situations in real time that we can apply that cycle to. And from that, we'll gain understanding. Colleen Cooney, or Eugenia Cooney, is an internet personality approaching her 30s. She thinks she's known for her content, but she's actually more known for her eating disorder. There are multiple videos describing her history and aspects that I'm not going to sit and repeat everything people already know. What we're discussing here is the fact that her case is not that surprising or unexpected or unique, and treating it like it is only perpetuates this narrative she desires to be true. Children have wrong ideas. Adults have wrong narratives formed by multiple ideas and experiences over the time they've been alive. A narrative is more powerful than an idea, and to grow past it takes a lot more than just a wake-up call. Millennials are an extremely stubborn generation, and you're lucky if they're stubborn in the right direction. So many people I know will die on the antiest of hills just to feel right, just because a bad idea of theirs was never allowed to be wrong. I cannot tell you how many friendships I've happily and begrudgingly dumped because of someone else's stubbornness and inability to move on from their past. Who, besides children, the elderly, and people you pay like therapists, have the time for that? Nobody, because they're in the middle of their own lives. And if you want to sit there and fault them for that, that sounds like the beginning of your issues, especially if they are someone in your immediate circle. It is overall more aggravating and ultimately damaging to pretend that the inability to regulate oneself is not a huge issue. It is a huge issue that the people who make up the majority of adults think something is inherently wrong with the world if they don't get what they want when they want it. The only ones sitting here and pretending I'm talking about real-world issues right now are the ones avoiding their real issues by diving into shit they will never be able to effectively solve on their own. And as long as those problems are avoided, all the money you raise, all the homes built, all the clean water sourced means nothing. Severe neglect is where we get this cultural phenomenon of any attention is good attention, and that is only true if we live in neglect. Lacey Fletcher made headlines in the recent years regarding her untimely death. She was murdered by her emotionally and physically neglectful parents over the course of 12 years. Lacey is like Eugenia. A parent does not need to be absent to be neglectful. The stats of neglect versus sheer abandonment are nothing to compare at the end of the day. Both have profoundly deleterious effects on the human brain. The reason to bring up these subtle differences is to point out the fact that when a parent is out of your life, you may yearn for that connection, but you can focus on other things and grow, move on. Chronic neglect, where the parent is just out of the child's reach, uncertain in what to trust, the child is in an uninterrupted state of emotional turmoil that will lead to emotional PTSD. It is so stressful when animosity is hanging in the air and the person you're trusting to soothe you is not only unreliable, but unpredictably dangerous. I feel like when people generally speak about concepts, they don't apply real-world context to them. When we say parents, most people seem to think just of their own or a general idea of what a parent is. When I say our parents failed us, I'm saying specifically that the parents of millennials, who are vastly a mix of Gen X and Gen Me, the boomers, were so entirely self-centered that they neglected their children to the degree that their physical deaths have occurred, and the psychic damage done as a whole is grotesque. Knowing the worst that has happened to another person helps us accept the reality of what happened to us. Any sort of trauma interrupts the brain the same exact way, but from there, the physical reality of consequences and aftermath exists. It is a choice to act upon the belief. For example, two people can agree the death of a loved one can change you so profoundly as someone assaulting you, but it's not that common for someone to need expensive specialized therapy after a death, whereas it is the most basic offer to someone who survived an assault. Emotional neglect is so closely linked to physical neglect. We have all heard the saying, out of sight, out of mind. Millennials are now parents, and we see how well that's going as a whole. If they're not relying on Bluey to regulate themselves, they're manipulating their children into being their emotional caretakers with fake forms of gentle parenting. Through infinite ways and reasons, millennial parents who have not broken their cycle of neglect have invented iPad kids. It may sound contradictory through bias, but millennials were the first generations to take the inward journey seriously. I've always said that generally millennials grew up to be some sort of teacher or some form of criminal. As we see it, YouTube and social media in general was popularized by millennials. Online millennials heard the legends moments after they were written and were there to witness the birth of the new. What millennials invented, Gen Z popularized, and so forth. Until you have the skill set to be engaged, loving, and present, all you are doing is eroding away at everything you love. The idea of responsibility makes you nervous, because you know there are people relying on you, but you are never taught how to deal with it because you were neglected. You deny it because you're content with it, but you can put only so many band-aids over a gaping wound. Millennials have been the generation to commit the most filicide. From 2000 until today, there are several thousand more cases of filicide than recorded from the 1970s till the 2000s. There wasn't a sudden or drastic spike, and that's the most worrisome part. This indicates not just a change in pattern, but the acceptance of one. If you've never heard the case of Sebastian Rogers, let me start by clarifying that nobody has been arrested or even promoted significantly as a person of interest in this case. Nobody has proven that anybody has had anything to do with his disappearance. That being said, the child is still gone and there's no sign of anything. We can explain away whatever we want and call that logic, but the truth is, even if his body is recovered, we may never know what happened. While women are more likely to kill their children in the earliest stages of their life, men tend to kill their children when they're bigger. Chris Watts, who you may be more familiar with, is a millennial. He may have gotten away with it if he wasn't so sheltered. Overly neglected millennials think they're good liars because nobody has ever cared enough about them as individuals to notice if they lied or not. They have become way too comfortable in this creative bubble of their own truths. They will literally go from work to home and do very little in between because when their worldviews are threatened, they can only stand to be the voice of reason or an impassioned victim. They don't meet new people out of their comfort zone, and when they do, they have to try to end up in control in some way. Overly neglected millennials are sociopaths. Sociopathy is taught, more so than it is an inherent biological trait. Even the childless millennials are unstable. That's part of why they decided not to have kids in the first place. And at least they can notice that about themselves, but they are mainly opportunistic and self-serving, regardless of the feelings of personal success. If you're evil or even complacent towards the future, what are you doing? They've already decided they have nothing to offer or give, and you can say that's not true, but there's no grand revolutionary point to make that refutes my claim. Good job making money, I guess. There's actually quite a lot of proof of my peers infantilizing themselves in the womb of their comfort zone. They're not committed to anything because they're simultaneously scared of consequences beyond their control, and they can't humble themselves long enough to have a real experience. Everything has to be a simulation. And at worse, some people like to treat life like a simulation because they've never seen consequences work the way it should. They were neglected. They feel unprepared, emotionally, financially, or through the mistake that thinking their children will be carbon copies of themselves, and that trauma is unavoidable. They are really controlling. They think humility came in the form of quieting themselves and assimilation. The most outspoken still looking around like they're crossing the street before vocalizing a thought. Millennials were emotionally manipulated into thinking about everyone else first, and you can see the effects of that in comment sections. If it's not outright empathy felt so strongly that their immediate life seems pointless, it's the rejection of it because both the pain of inability and the knowledge of suffering are too much for the average person to bear for long, which leads to emotional burnout, even in good people. Everyone is valid was the liberal version of all lives matter. Sometimes, validity is the last thing you should apply to a situation. Do we know what the term valid even means anymore? It's when something has reason and sound logic when presenting itself. I'm sure the girl Ted Bundy tricked into sympathizing for him with his fake-ass broken arm thought he was valid too in that moment. It's disappointing and strange how people will get their information from faceless memes, but when someone is face-to-face with them sharing their knowledge, they can't recognize that as valid. It's very interesting how blatantly hypocritical these neglected people act without a drop of awareness. All because their twisting logic serves the purpose they have already decided exists. Twisting words to suit your own definition of them is manipulation. It's frankly disgusting how people are allowed to act inconsequentially while others get lambasted. One of the most common phrases you hear now from Gen Z and Gen Alpha is, "What are they gonna do? What are you gonna do? What's really gonna happen?" Chivalry is dead. Bitter men killed it. And you can't argue that because they were the most welcome outside the house much longer than the rest of us. They made up the rules, and when we played by them, they changed them, and now they can't even remember how it was. People don't commit themselves to a code of honor, and values like respect, responsibility, and integrity aren't seen as worth much, but are praised in others in extremely disconnected ways. People do not draw lines for themselves. Social media has rewarded people for perpetuating neglect through shallow connections and performative empathy. Cancel culture can also be seen as a byproduct of neglect because it's power wielded by otherwise powerless people. And the effect is that people don't stick around for the long term, even though we're all going to be here for a very long time. We can't get ourselves together to take care of the country, but by God, we can pretend Kanye West isn't going to sell tickets or shirts. Neglect has let otherwise good men allow their ego to have the last word, because they think the world begins and ends with their feelings getting hurt. These are the only times they let themselves become aware. This perpetuates the neglect and creates resentment. Half-assing responsibility keeps standards dry and kills creativity. I feel like this should be repeated. People in all areas of life do not have a code of honor they commit themselves to anymore. They bend rules for themselves and come up with excuses and never develop the tools to deal with things gracefully. Millennials are a generation at war with itself, toggling between extreme performative empathy and complete emotional detachment. The stubbornness and inability to compromise has had a ridiculous hit on the statistics regarding friendships, romantic relationships, marriages, and workplace conflicts. If you're serious about breaking the cycle, listen to me right now. They don't want us because they took themselves for granted. Our inherent worth is so far beyond a broken system, generational trauma, and unhealed wounds. It's up to us to stop neglecting ourselves and the future. Don't use your self-awareness to define your limits. Find your responsibilities outside what you grew up with. Set boundaries with your parents and at work, not just with your partners. Anything you find yourself feeling shame for, find someone to talk about it with, even if it's anonymous. Healing begins with recognition and acknowledgement. Offer grace, not guilt, for yourself and others. Challenge and rebuild your self-esteem. Make time to complete something from start to finish. Volunteer yourself and make yourself do a great job. Quit being afraid to set an expectation or a standard. The comparison trap is real and a huge waste of time. If you're a parent, just focus on being conscious and aware. Gentle parenting runs a fine line between neglect simply because you think you can tell your kids something a couple times and it'll just stick forever, and any mistake they make after you tell them is on them to figure out by themselves or something they're doing to spite you. Human children are born to be very dependent, and the palpable disgust for anything that shows dependency is a toxic millennial trait brought down by neglect. If you're not a parent, the same rule applies to your relationships. For some reason, millennials fell for the Gen X trend of thinking other people are like a waste of time, when the reality is just a huge inability to set boundaries. Emotional neglect thrives where feelings are dismissed. It's ruder to ignore someone's harmful behavior than telling them outright to shut their mouths. You are exhausted from trying to heal yourself while trying to raise perfect children. Only one of those things is feasible. Burnout will never heal itself and has similar effects to alcohol abuse. Don't mess up and wait to be told you're not being judged for your mistake. Mess up and expect to be forgiven. And quit putting so much focus on mistakes, whether it's positive or negative. Responsibility is empowerment. Millennials fear responsibility due to neglect. They have never been shown the right ways. Time management apps, asking your friends or roommates to engage in peer accountability, and gradual exposure to tasks make the overwhelming idea of doing it all on your own is a lot easier to manage. Remembering that people are creatures of habit, regardless of how intentional or self-aware you think you're being, creating a schedule and letting your muscle memory take the wheel will release a lot of tension otherwise created by overthinking what to do. Reclaim your community, your time, your connections. Write down everything you like within your immediate vicinity that you can access. Write down all of the things you like to do. And think about the time you've dedicated to just doing those things. Go to volunteer at different locations that support the community, or just see what public events are and go for a few minutes. You need to expose yourself, and nobody can do that for you but you. Breaking the cycle is way more than just realizing what happened to you was wrong and breathing in and out. Healing is non-linear but possible, so quit procrastinating. Quit relying on lame-ass dark humor. Look up emotionally numbing behaviors and stop those. You can't build a community if you're burnt out, and you can't stop being burnt out if you misuse isolation as a tool. When you're around people, you hate it, but you miss them when you're alone. You need to be way more purposeful in your interactions. You need to live a life that isn't intercepted by arrested development. Please share in the comments your stories and experiences of hope. If you have broken the cycle of neglect and have found peace, purpose, and self-love, please share. I want to remind you that you are perfect the way you are. You were never forgotten. You were never abandoned. And no one who matters has given up on you. Please explore who you really are, instead of holding fear for what you're not.